What just happened in that Senate hearing was more than a debate. It was a moment that made millions of Americans stop and ask, wait, does the FBI director even understand the Constitution? Because when Senator Jeff Merkley leaned forward and asked Kash Patel a question every high school civics student could answer, the silence that followed said more than any prepared statement ever could. Think about this: the man leading America's top law enforcement agency, the one sworn to uphold the rule of law, couldn't clearly explain one of the most basic guarantees in the Bill of Rights: due process. It's the principle that no government, no official, no power of the state can strip away your liberty without fair procedure.
$500 million.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission and am in support of the budget here. And I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution? It says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status. The Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
And when Merkley asked Patel if he even knew what that meant, what followed turned from awkward to unbelievable in seconds. Merkley didn't start with fireworks. He began methodically thanking Patel, acknowledging his testimony, and then with surgical precision he cornered him. Yesterday, Merkley said, "You asked for an additional $1 billion for drug interdiction, fentanyl control, and anti-terrorism. But today you're presenting a budget that cuts $500 million. His tone was calm, but every word was a trap laid carefully. "Which is it? Do you want us to add $1 billion or cut $500 million? And Patel stumbled. The man responsible for running the FBI tried to have it both ways, supporting a budget cut while also asking for more money. He said, "With more I can simply do more." It was the kind of answer that sounds safe in a press release, but not under oath. Merkley pressed him again, "So you support both the increase and the cut?" Patel's reply, "I can't not support the budget as proposed," didn't clear things up. It only raised more questions. But Merkley wasn't done with numbers. That opening exchange was a setup. The real confrontation was still coming. Because right after that confusion, Merkley leaned in and asked something so basic, so foundational, it should have been effortless for any American official to answer. "Director Patel," he said, "you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment?" Patel nodded. "Yes, Senator." Merkley continued, his tone steady but sharp. "That's the Freedom Clause of the United States, the guarantee that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Then, without missing a beat, Merkley added, "You understand that applies to all persons in the United States, correct?" And that's when it happened. Patel froze. His voice shifted, and suddenly he sounded uncertain. "I'm not in a position to comment on whether they were given or not given due process," he said. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Merkley's eyes narrowed. "So you're not sure?" Patel tried to dodge again. "The FBI arrests those who violate the law. That's all we do." But Merkley wasn't talking about arrests. He was talking about constitutional rights. He brought up the reports that hundreds of immigrants had been swept off the streets across the U.S. and sent to El Salvador without hearings. "Doesn't that concern you?" he asked. And again Patel hesitated. "Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization." At that moment Merkley's frustration broke through. "Do you agree with the Fifth Amendment?" he asked. "Are you prepared to defend it?" Patel replied, "I agree with the entire Constitution." "So are you going to investigate the violation of due process for these hundreds of individuals?" Merkley pressed. Patel tried to step back again. "That's not for me to call balls and strikes on," he said. "I'm not a constitutional scholar." That line, "I'm not a constitutional scholar," was the breaking point. You could almost hear the room exhale. Because this wasn't a law school exam, it was a hearing before Congress. And here was the FBI director saying, essentially, "I don't know what the Fifth Amendment means in practice." Merkley couldn't believe it. He leaned forward, his voice tight. "It's not a question of scholarship, Director Patel, it's a question of law. The Fifth Amendment says no persons, not no citizen, not no documented resident, all persons. I have it right here." He literally held up the Constitution, that tiny booklet that millions of Americans have seen politicians wave before but rarely quote from so directly. And Merkley read it out loud. It says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty or property without due process of law. Then he looked Patel dead in the eye. That means everyone. Patel looked flustered. I'll encourage you to read it, Merkley continued, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court, Miranda v. Arizona, Reno v. Flores, over and over again. It's black and white. Patel tried to defend himself, saying he understood due process and had been a public defender before leading the FBI. But the damage was done. The entire exchange had exposed something deeper, not just confusion, but complacency. The idea that protecting constitutional rights is someone else's job. Merkley wasn't just defending immigrants, he was defending the principle that separates democracy from tyranny. Because the second you say, it's not my job to defend rights, you're admitting that rights only matter when convenient. And that's why this moment hit so hard. You could see it in Merkley's expression, part disbelief, part determination. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director? He asked. Patel hesitated, then finally said, sure. Just that one word, sure. Merkley sat back. Good, he said quietly. But everyone in the room knew what that sure really meant. It wasn't confidence, it was surrender. And that's the problem. Because due process isn't some abstract legal theory, it's the foundation of fairness itself. It's what keeps a government from turning into a machine that crushes whoever stands in its way. The Fifth Amendment was written to stop exactly that kind of power. Merkley's outrage wasn't political theater, it was alarm. Because if the director of the FBI can shrug off questions about the Constitution with, "I'm not a scholar," then we've crossed into dangerous territory. It's the same logic officials have used throughout history to justify abuse. It's not my department, that's not my decision, someone else handles that. But here's the truth, every erosion of freedom begins that way, not with an open declaration of tyranny, but with quiet indifference. When Patel said it wasn't his place to decide whether deportations violated due process, Merkley shot back, the Supreme Court's already decided that. He listed case after case, reminding Patel and the audience that the phrase all persons has always meant exactly what it says. Still, Patel insisted that removal proceedings were a separate branch of government. Merkley countered, so if another agency violates the Constitution, you won't investigate. Patel answered, I will investigate every violation of law, but even that sounded hollow after everything else he'd said. And this is where the exchange became something larger than two men in a hearing room. It turned into a mirror reflecting the state of American power, how disconnected it's become from the values it's supposed to defend. Merkley, a senator with a copy of the Constitution in his hand, was reminding the head of the FBI that rights aren't selective. That all persons means all, that law enforcement doesn't get to decide who counts as human under the law. What made it so powerful wasn't the shouting, there wasn't much of that, it was the calm insistence on truth. The senator didn't have to grandstand, he just had to quote the words every official swears to uphold. And the more Patel tried to justify, the clearer it became how far we've drifted from that oath. Merkley wasn't defending a party or an ideology, he was defending a promise, the promise that justice applies to everyone, the guilty and the innocent, the citizen and the stranger. That's the entire point of due process. Once you start making exceptions, you don't have justice anymore, you have privilege. When Patel said, I have the Constitution right here, Merkley's reply, then read it, wasn't a clapback, it was a warning. Because having the document doesn't mean you understand it. Anyone can quote the Constitution when it suits them. The real test is whether you follow it when it's inconvenient. That's what this moment revealed, the difference between holding the Constitution and upholding it. Patel represents an institution that touches every part of American life, surveillance, investigations, prosecutions. When the person at the top can't confidently affirm something as basic as due process, that's not a small slip, that's a red flag waving over the entire system. And Merkley's closing words made that crystal clear. It's important to remind you, he said, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution, you could feel the sting in that line. Not because it was personal, but because it was true. For viewers watching this hearing later, it wasn't just political theater, it was a wake-up call. If the guardians of justice forget what they're guarding, who's left to protect the rest of us? This exchange might fade from the headlines in a week, but its meaning won't, because it asks a question bigger than politics. Are we becoming a nation that treats the Constitution like a slogan instead of a standard? Merkley reminded the country that no person means every person, that our laws are supposed to restrain government, not empower it to act without consequence. And that's why this matters, because the erosion of due process anywhere is a threat to due process everywhere. You might think this only affects the people deported or detained, but look closer. Once the system decides it can deny rights to one group, it sets a precedent to deny them to others. The Constitution doesn't protect groups, it protects principles. And once those principles are ignored, the entire structure starts to crumble. Merkley's confrontation wasn't just about Patel's understanding of the Fifth Amendment, it was about whether America still lives by the ideals it was founded on. The real danger isn't that one official misspoke, it's that the system might no longer see the difference between legal power and moral authority. The FBI director doesn't need to be a scholar, he needs to be a leader who understands that justice isn't negotiable, that when the Constitution says no person, it doesn't leave room for footnotes. That's why this exchange went viral, because deep down, people recognized it wasn't about policy, it was about principle, about whether the rule of law still means what it once did. When Merkley said, "That's what the Constitution says, I encourage you to read it," it wasn't just directed at Patel, it was aimed at everyone in government who's forgotten that power must always bow to the law, not the other way around. Moments like this don't happen often, when the mask of bureaucracy slips just enough to show what's really underneath. And what we saw wasn't confidence, it was confusion, the kind that spreads when institutions stop holding themselves accountable. Merkley's voice, calm but relentless, reminded everyone watching that democracy isn't self-sustaining, it needs people willing to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, because the Constitution isn't just ink on paper, it's a contract, a living promise between the government and the governed. And every time an official dodges its meaning, that promise weakens a little more. So what should we take away from this? That one senator's insistence on due process might have sounded small in that chamber, but symbolically, it was massive. It was a reminder that freedom doesn't vanish in a single day, it erodes quietly, through moments like this, when those in power decide that the rules don't apply to everyone. If you're watching this right now, here's what matters: pay attention. Learn what your rights really are. Don't assume the people in charge understand them better than you do, because as we just saw, sometimes they don't. The Constitution was written for you, not for politicians to quote, but for citizens to defend. And if you believe that due process, fairness and accountability are worth protecting, then don't tune out. Stay curious. Stay engaged. Subscribe, like this video, and keep questioning what you see in these hearings, because democracy doesn't survive on autopilot, it survives when people like you refuse to look away.